Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. George Washington slept here, and here, and here, and here. Well, the claims are seemingly endless, but the proof is in the pudding and sometimes hard to find, so today we're going to bring that pudding to the table. Our guest is Dr. Robert Seelig, and he's no stranger to this program. We've been honored to have Bob Seelig with us several times in the past on matters dealing with the Revolutionary War. See, Bob's the chief consultant to the National Park Service for the Rochambeau Trail from Rhode Island all the way down to Virginia, and he's exceptionally knowledgeable about that entire time period. He's going to be along in just a moment to help us separate fact from fiction when it comes to just where did Washington sleep on the 10 times that he was in Connecticut. This week's trivia question: what's black and white and red all over and is older than the United States herself? We'll stick around after the main program for the answer to that question, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. It's a bit of a time-honored joke claiming that George Washington slept in your house. Washington was so popular back in the 1700s that people wanted to have an association with him any time that he stepped foot in your house back in those days. Well, for some, that was good enough for saying he slept there too. In fact, our guest today has done the definitive research and can tell us that Washington made 10 trips through Connecticut in his lifetime, from the time he was a young man to the time as president when he was over 60 years old. Dr. Bob Seelig is the chief consultant to the National Park Service, and they're creating the Rochambeau Trail from Rhode Island to Virginia so that the public can visit the key points along the 700-mile route that Rochambeau and his 5,000 soldiers marched to help Washington defeat the British at Yorktown, Virginia. Now, due to a variety of circumstances, and we all know about ripping down history and putting up a parking lot, only 10 structures remain standing where Washington actually once spent a night in Connecticut. Now, these are the towns in alphabetical order where those structures stand: Farmington, Lebanon, Litchfield, Newtown, New London, Norwich, by the way, has 2, Old Lyme, Wethersfield, and Windsor. Now, on my Facebook page, which is at Amazing Tales CT, I'll share the list of the houses in each town where he spent at least one night. Now, just because your town wasn't named in that list doesn't mean that Washington wasn't there or didn't have some sort of association with your community, because during his travels, he actually hit a large number of towns and cities across the state. And this story, it's just lots of fun and informative. So let's get right into it with Bob Seelig. Bob, I want to start off by asking you, when I first asked you, where did he stay when he was in Connecticut? I expected it was going to be a fairly straightforward answer, and come to find out, you really had to do a ton of research just to really specify where that was. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing with the listeners the kind of sources you had to go to dig up this kind of information.
The primary sources, or the best sources for doing research about this kind of stuff is, of course, the diary. And Washington kept a diary on and off. So occasionally his diary tells us exactly where he is and where he stayed and which roads he's taken. But in instances in his life where he does not keep a diary, certainly during the Revolutionary War, we have his expense account as a wonderful source, because Washington, even though he did not accept a salary from Congress when Congress appointed him commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he did want to be reimbursed for his expenses. And so he keeps a very detailed expense accounts. These accounts are submitted to Congress for reimbursement. And those expense accounts are wonderful because they tell us not only where Washington stayed, but also who else was traveling with him, his aides de camp, his servants, his slave, Billy Lee. And suddenly, when Washington stays overnight at such and such a place, the expense account tells us that he actually paid for 34 horses and 18 breakfasts for his whole entourage, his bodyguard, and what have you. So those two sources connected directly with Washington are full of information. Other sources, of course, are newspapers in the big cities like New York City or in Boston. Another source are private letters sent by Washington. It tells us where he is at the time.
I think that one of the more interesting ledger entries was when he had to pay, I think it was $250 to get a horse rescued out of some water.
Yes, he was on his way in 1781. He is on his way to meet with Rochambeau in Hartford, and he's taking the route far away from the coast and crosses into Connecticut at Bull's Bridge. And apparently, the covered bridge, there still is one, but it's not the original, was in fairly bad shape, and one of his horses broke through the planks, and it had to be pulled out. I would imagine they had to construct some kind of a contraption to pull the horse out, and yet the expense for getting that horse out of the bridge is also recorded in the expense account.
One of the things that I really appreciated that you did was when you were identifying the different trips that Washington made into Connecticut, you identified the fact that there were more or less 3 chapters of his life, I'll call them chapters, where he was in the state. One was when he was very young, 24, and we'll talk about that in a second. The second one was when he was commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces, and we'll talk about those separately. And the last one, of course, when he was the first president of the United States and all the activities there. And again, we'll talk about those separately as well. Let's start with the first trip. And there's not a lot known about this because this is one of those times nobody really understood at age 24 when he's running the Virginia militia that he's going to be so important in terms of American history. So not a lot of records were kept and not a lot of attention was paid to George Washington at that time. But he's 24 years old. He's on his way up to Massachusetts to meet with the governor, William Shelby. What was he going there to talk to him about, and did he get it?
On his first trip, his first out of a total of 10 trips into and across Connecticut, as you said, was on his way to Boston to talk to Governor Shirley. At that point, Washington is the colonel of the Virginia Militia Regiment, and we're talking 1756, the beginning of the French and Indian War, and he is a colonel of the Virginia Militia Regiment. But of his hope and his dream is to get a regular commission in the British Army. British Army, the regulars look down on the militia as, part-time soldiers and what have you. And he wants to get a regular commission and thereby bring his militia regiment, the Virginia Militia Regiment, also into the Royal Army with all the benefits this brings as far as wages, etc. But Shirley won't have any of it, and he turns Washington's request down, and so he goes back to Virginia and commands his militia regiment then through the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it is called here.
Now, in those days, of course, there weren't a whole lot of options for getting from New York to Boston. There were the original post roads, the King's Highway. And in that first trip, Washington went that southern route along the coast and ended up, I think if I have it right, stopped in about New London and took a boat from there, or went a boat to Newport.
That is correct. The more convenient and easier travel was probably by boat. But there's an interesting letter by a man named Joseph Chu in New London to Washington, in which he tells him that the horses that he left behind, one was lame, the other had stomach problems, are feeling better, and on the way back he can pick them up there. So it seems like the decision to switch from horseback riding to boat was not necessarily Washington's first choice. It sounds like it was imposed upon him simply because his horses needed a break of a couple of weeks, and Washington didn't want to wait that long. And on the way back to then, he picks up his horses and then rides the rest of the way through New York City down to his home in Virginia, down to Mount Vernon.
So his first trip, he goes up, he meets the governor. The governor says, no, you're not going to be in the British regular army. You're still going to be the Virginia militia. And of course, this is before the War of Independence, so everybody is, quote unquote, still British. The second time now that the second series of trips that Washington will make through Connecticut will be as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, which is just incredible. So this is now 1775. We've had the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord, and the Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia, and they select Washington, and what do they ask him to do?
Congress creates the Continental Army on the 14th of June, 1775, and then the next day unanimously elect or select Washington as commander-in-chief. He gets his commission, and on the 22nd of June, he's told to go to Boston and take charge of the siege of Boston. And by the way, it's up to you to kind of create that Continental Army out of the militia and whatever else is up there around Boston. Washington has a diary up to his commission on the 19th of June, and then faced with what must have been an overwhelming workload, he stops keeping a diary until January of 1780. So unfortunately for the next 4.5 years, we don't have a diary and do not really have an insight into his most private thoughts and thinking, which he would put into a diary rather than into letters that you send off to other people. But we have his expense account.
Now, the interesting part, I think, as well, is to look at what age Washington was at all these different steps. So when he first went up to see the governor, he was 24. When he comes back to handle the siege in Boston, it's basically 20 years later. He's 44 or 43 years old. And then he will come back for what is arguably his most important series of visits, which are to interact with and meet and strategize with Rochambeau. There were 3 different visits, one to Hartford, one to Newport, and the third one to Wethersfield, where they spent 5 days strategizing. Can you give us I know you could talk for hours on this, but can you give us kind of a summary of those visits and what Washington was doing in Connecticut during those visits?
Of course. As you said, Washington in 1780 and 1781 travels into Connecticut and through Connecticut 3 times. Every time the trip has a different purpose. We know that in July of 1780, French forces under the Comte de Rochambeau land in Newport in Rhode Island in July, and they are the long expected and long awaited reinforcement for the Continental Army with regular troops, with artillery, with cavalry, and most of all, with funds, with money. The first trip in Hartford in September of 1780 is basically a getting to know each other, a visit. Washington had hoped that as soon as the French forces get off the boats, we start the siege of New York City. And Rochambeau says, well, not quite so fast. We need to recover. We've been on the ocean for over 100 days. Nothing's going to happen this year. But Washington decides he needs to meet with Rochambeau simply to get to know him. And that's why he rides and travels to Hartford to meet with him, to get to know him. And that first meeting goes very, very well. And then afterwards, the troops go into winter quarters. And the second time Washington meets with Rochambeau is in Newport in March of 1781. That's a journey where he travels again through Bullsbridge, Farmington, Hartford, through Lebanon to visit with his good friend Jonathan Trumbull, the governor of Connecticut, where one of Trumbull's sons then becomes Washington's private secretary. And then he rides along the coast to Narragansett Ferry and crosses over into Newport again to meet with Rochambeau. Again, it's a very brief visit and it's more like a courtesy visit, but clearly, we're in March now. By the time Washington gets back to Newport, it's going to be April. It's time to talk about what are we going to do this coming campaign in the summer of 1781. And Rochambeau again has to tell him, I don't have any instructions yet from Versailles. I was told there would be a second division, another 6,000 men that will come. I was told that before I left last March, almost a year ago. My son is over in Versailles right now trying to find out what's going on. And to make a long story short, Rochambeau has to kind of tell Washington to just relax. I don't know how many resources I have and how much money. Just give me another week or 2 or 3, then we will know more. These couple of weeks go over very quickly because by early May 1781, Rochambeau knows that the second division will not come, but he got a couple of million more livres, and that's the point now when the two commanders decide to meet for a third time in May of 1781 in Wethersfield in the Dean House. During this third meeting, Rochambeau knows these are the troops that I have. This is the amount of money that I have. Now let's discuss what we are going to do, which is to concentrate their forces around the town of Greenburgh in Westchester County and prepare for a siege of New York City.
Now, of course, as we know, and we're not going to go into the details in this episode, the siege of New York did not happen for a variety of reasons. They ended up going to Yorktown and having the final battle there. But these were critically important meetings to the Revolutionary War and the outcome of it, and they happened in Connecticut, which is interesting because Washington did what so many people in modern day do, which is they had to go through Connecticut to get from New York to Boston. It's almost like the pass-through state, and he did that as well. But these meetings in Connecticut were absolutely critical. Now, we will have on my Facebook page, if you go there, we'll have more information about the actual locations where Washington stayed while he was there. But to talk about the last 2 trips, I think these are very important because after the war, Washington, now the father of the nation, the first president of the United States, and he decides to do a tour around and sort of take the temperature. How's the country doing? How's the economy? What are people thinking and saying? And he decides to do this not as some high-level official, but more or less as a common man staying at local taverns. And he did this in Connecticut as well, didn't he?
Yes, he did. The last time that Washington then travels across Connecticut in 1789 is as a 60-year-old man. This time he travels in a carriage, though every time he rides into a town, he mounts a white horse so he can ride into that town. He is, as you said, taking the temperature in a way of the nation that he helped create and of which he will now be the first president. And this time, what is interesting is he keeps a diary again, but now the war being over, he doesn't have to worry about soldiers and how to feed them, etc. He takes the time to record manners and customs, crop yields, road conditions, as if he were taking stock of the country that he is traveling through at 30, 40 miles, maybe a day, depending on the quality of the roads. Again, there's a clear progression, I think, from the first time that he travels across Connecticut in 1756, when he has his own future, his own career in mind, to the second group of journeys when victory has to be foremost in his mind, is the military aspects and components. And then once peace has come and he has been elected president, is again a different reason. Now, as you said today, people consider Connecticut a place that you have to get through to get to Boston from New York City. I fully understand what you're saying. Let's, however, not be misled here. Lebanon, Connecticut, for example, and Governor Trumbull were immensely important for the success of the war. Connecticut is not for naught called the provisions state, where when Washington was in desperate need of food supplies, etc., he could always count on Governor Trumbull to come up with something. Lebanon was as important as Hartford during the War of Independence. It's not coincidental that Washington spends a lot of time in Connecticut, knowing how important the state and its citizens had been. If you look at the percentage of males that had served at some point or another in the Continental Army, the percentage in Connecticut is as high as that of any other state, if not higher.
Would you please correct me if I'm wrong with this following statement, but if I understand it correctly, Governor Trumbull was the only governor of any of the colonies who supported the Patriot effort. Is that true?
That is correct. And he also was the only governor who was governor of Connecticut when it was a British colony, and who seamlessly switched over to becoming the governor of the state of Connecticut. He was that popular and that good at what he had been doing that people immediately almost forgave him the fact that he had been a royal governor and now becomes the governor of the state of Connecticut.
One final question. You, of all people, have certainly been to these locations where Washington did actually sleep. Do you get a special feeling when you're inside one of these houses? Do you stop and feel a moment of reverence or whatever when you are in a house where Washington was?
First, I look around at the interior, what it's like, and I just close my eyes and try to block out police sirens and traffic outside and imagine the voices, the sounds that people 250 years ago would have made. Boots on the wooden floors, to place myself back into the 1770s and 1780s as far as that's concerned. And yes, knowing that Washington, Archambault, Lafayette were in here as well and made decisions that changed the course of history, not just for the United States, but for the world as a whole, can be quite humbling. Let's put it that way.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Recently, my wife and I had a chance to tour the Joseph Webb House. That's in the old Wethersfield section of Wethersfield. We stood in the very room where George Washington spent 5 nights. Now, that's the most nights he spent in any house in the state. He stayed there when he was strategizing with Rochambeau on the military steps to be taken to beat the British. And all I can say was it was an amazing feeling to stand there in that room and just imagine what must have been going through Washington's mind as he had the entire burden of fighting for the independence of the country on his shoulders at the ripe age of 44. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Dr. Robert Selig. He's chief consultant to the National Park Service for the Rochambeau Trail from Rhode Island to Virginia. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, what's black and white and red all over and is older than the United States herself? Well, it's the Hartford Courant newspaper. Started publishing long before the Declaration of Independence was even an idea in the founding father's mind. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to talk to the chief capital correspondent who writes for the Courant. He's been with the paper nearly 35 years, and he's got some great stories to tell us about this inspiring story. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.